is an instructional tech coach currently working in the North Shore of Chicago. Her teaching journey spans various communities from urban Kansas City to Dubai. Armed with master's degrees in educational technology, educational theater, and mind, brain, and education, as well as a whole lot of sarcasm, Kelly combines diverse experience as a classroom educator, computer teacher, tech support, tech trainer, and coach, with a passion to remove the fear of using tech. Welcome, Kelly. And I'm Linda, your webinar facilitator. I'll be behind the scenes, making sure that everything runs smoothly, as well as interacting with you in the chat. So let's get started.
Hi, all. I'm so excited to be here. I've done this presentation in all kinds of forms, live and in webinars and workshops. And this will be my first time doing it with the LTC. So thank you for wanting to come sit through something in May. I'm super excited. So today we're going to talk about visuals and how they impact learning. And if you spend any time with me, I don't care if we're at a social event, a party, very quickly you're going to hear me talk about brain research and you're going to hear me talk about visuals. I'm very passionate. So we're going to talk a little bit about some of the science and the why, and that it does matter what we put on screen. So the first thing is, I will tell you that I wish I'd known this years ago, but do you know there's a job called design psychologist? Those are the people who figured out that like blue makes us calm, and that if you are around colors like red and yellow, it stimulates your appetite. Hello, McDonald's. I just think that sounds like the coolest job ever. And that is what I would have if I could go back in time. All right. So let's start talking about the brain. So our brains can only handle so much. We know that, right? And there are sort of three ways that we can overwhelm our brain. We can have what we call intrinsic cognitive load, which is when you're introduced to new things. We can have germane cognitive load, which is when we're trying to process new information with stuff we have. This is where I get hung up a lot, when things don't match. And then the third one is when we have like extra things on a page. And that's something we see a lot in design, especially if you've ever had a middle schooler design a slide deck and they have like 35 graphics on the page. They put us into cognitive load. It's got all this extra unnecessary information. So we have our working memory, which is sort of our short term, and our long term. And the way that we load down those pages can really make it a challenge for us to take things from that short-term working memory and make it really go into our students' long-term memory. So we've heard some of these stats before, right? That we can hold like 3 or 4 bits of new information at once. It's lasted like 20 seconds to 20 minutes. And then if it's not integrated, it's lost. So let's imagine that we have given kids who are, the YouTube generation, the TikTok generation, kids who are used to Instagram, and then, they love graphic novels. And then you hand them this giant thing of block text that you typed as a Google Doc, and there's no images and there's no color and there's not a lot of spacing. And then we're surprised when they can't retain that. Well, we've given them too much. We haven't given them any kind of clues visually to help them flip that over. And so we're actually impacting negatively their ability to comprehend the learning. Just things to think about as you're designing, that you don't have too much text, that there's not so much design. And when I talk about heavy design, I'm going to show you some examples later of like where we have oversaturated the walls in our classrooms, and it makes it really hard for kids to understand what's important when everything feels like it's important. We have to think about our ML friends and the unfamiliar vocabulary. So if you're already having them have to read a lot of text, plus it's new vocabulary, plus there isn't any kind of visual clue for them, that can be lead to cognitive overload. We can also talk about too many pathways. I have a really good example of that. Those of you that are my age, I'm older. We used to do these things called web quests with kids, where we would like send them on these sort of choose your own adventure research paths. And we would make it so unclear what was the start and what was the end goal. And I have a great example of that. And then just the large quantities of information. We all know that we get overwhelmed by that. So today I'm going to sort of divide everything into 4, technically 5 categories. We're going to talk about text, design, color, graphics, and then I have a bonus extra section for you. I have way more information in this slide deck than we could possibly cover today. I usually run this as a longer workshop. So we'll just hit as much as we can. And I'm kind of got my eye on the chat. So if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to ask me to pause. All right, so let's talk about text. I know there are a lot of people who are passionate about font. I am definitely one of those people. But did you know that the ideal length to comprehend something on a screen is 85 to 100 characters in a line? This comes from someone named Mary Dyson. She's done a ton of research on this. And this is actually longer than in a book. The number for book is actually shorter. But if you think about a Google Doc that has a 0.5 margins on the side, Arial size 12, that's about the right size that you want, and you want that fit. You want that not zoomed in, but it just your standard on a standard. I think it's really 15-inch screens get a little bit big, so we're thinking more like imagine your 13-inch laptop, and imagine that you've got this Google Doc, and it's got 0.5 margins, size 12 Arial. That is the ideal size for the brain. This gives you a chance to sort of be able to sort of pre-skim with your brain before you actually do the real reading. And I'm going to go ahead and pop open a Google Doc. So we're going to come in here to our page margins. You can see mine are default to that 0.5. And I'm going to change the size 12 Arial. And then I am going to write some text and fill in the page. And I'm going to just copy that for time so that I repeat it, not great grammar. But as you can see, as I start filling this out, that is about the width you want this to be. Now, some of us start to get where we zoom in. This is pretty good. You certainly don't want to be any closer, and you don't want to be any further away, because the reason I typed this out is I want to tell you how your eyes work. When you read, your eyeballs jump. So if you can see my cursor, I kind of jump every about 4 to 5 words. And then your brain actually goes back, and then it jumps from the new spot. So that is how we read. And then we go back, and then we go forward, and we go back, and then we fill the next line. So if you have too much text width-wise, or you don't have enough line spacing, your eyes actually have trouble tracking, and that lowers our comprehension. Hopefully that makes sense. Also, the more space that you have around your text, the better, because white space helps your brain naturally chunk things together, kind of how we chunk phone numbers. We can also chunk visually. And so you want to have space in between things. Like I tend to get a lot of lists from people where they've bulleted and they don't have space in between those bullet points. And it's actually a lot harder for your brain to comprehend. And the younger a kid is, the more white space we should have around all 4 sides of our text boxes. Okay. So I want to show an example of that. This is the default when you go into Google. This is what the single spacing looks like. And if you're just glancing at this, you're probably thinking, there's nothing wrong with that. And then here is the double spaced version. And some people like that, and that's okay. But this is sort of that Goldilocks just right. This is when it's spaced at 1.5. And you can see that compared to the too small, there's just a little bit more of a gap. And that helps that eyes, remember, they're bouncing, and they're bouncing in this sort of half circle shape. And if I don't have some space, do you see as if I bounce the second line, I'm starting to get tangled in the first line of text, and that starts to impact that comprehension. So we really want to make sure that we have a little bit of a gap. This is actually too big of a gap. It makes it hard for you to track. So this is sort of that sweet spot, the just right. This is what I was mentioning earlier. It's really hard for people to sometimes follow when you do things in a bulleted list and there's no space, because even though you have a bullet, there's no chunking that's happening. So here we are with a little bit of space. This is the same thing. And I don't know about you, but I personally have like a visceral response. Like if I look at up here versus I look down here, I actually have a moment where my eyes feel like a little bit of a break. There's a couple of ways that you can add this space. The first one is you can highlight. And if you come up here, and I have some directions over on the side here, you can add a space after list items. That's one way to do it. Another way is if you hit Shift Enter, that will do it as well. I think it's important to know about the Shift Enter because there's no other way in Gmail. There's no sort of add space after in a lot of like Google's other products, including Gmail. So if you know about the Shift Enter, you can see that it causes it to add a space without adding a new bullet. Okay, so I really, hit a button, sorry. So I really want to show you, this is a page from the Danielson model. As teachers, I'm sure we're all familiar with that. And this is what it looks like if you get like their PDF book. This page is what it looks like on their website. There are the same amount of words on both pages. Now let's just compare this. This is left side is printed and the right side is the web page. Again, this is one of those times where I have a very visceral reaction. Like I feel a sense of relief with this one because it's just too hard for me to process. There's just not enough space. So by adding a little bit of space to both the left and the right, by making the box have some color contrast, I know that my eyes are going to be drawn to this. By making the considerations shorter as opposed to stretching them, this just feels a little bit better and it will help with the brain. So let's go back to what we hand our kids. If you type up something in a Google Doc for kids and you're handing it to them and you're giving it with no spaces, you don't have any color, you don't have any headers, any sort of section breaks, you don't have any sort of visuals for them, it feels like this overwhelming thing to kids. But just by tweaking a few little things to what we've already created, we can just make it a little more comprehensible. This is an example from Cult of Pedagogy. If you're not familiar, she's phenomenal. This is something we don't want to do, that she was giving an example of bad and good. And what's happening here is we do this a lot to kids. We want them to be able to reference our slide deck later, or I do a lot of PD as an instructional coach. And a lot of times people are like, oh, I want people to be able to reference my slide deck. So we put this up. We have all these words. We're talking about it, and there's no visual help. That is going to cause cognitive overload. We have now used 3 different parts of our brain instead of just 2, which is the max that we can handle. So if you look at something like this versus this. Now, if I was giving this to a group of people to read on their own, I certainly would give them this. But if I'm going to be talking about these and training these things, then giving short, big font, lots of white space in between, you will be able to keep up with what I'm saying, and your brain will actually create its own meaning more by me not writing it out for you than if I gave you this. This, I did the work for you. There was no desirable difficulty. And so you're not going to make meaning yourself, versus this. They actually have shown in study after study that if they go back in a layout like this and ask people what they remember more, because you had to be intentional about making this part of your memory. So this is a graphic that I love to give to my people who are like new to sort of design, and they're like, okay, so here's what this says. You can have 2 things. This is, you could be talking to people, you can be showing them pictures, or you could give people text with an image or picture. But what we can't do is we can't talk to people, have text, and give them images. We shouldn't be talking to people and giving them large amount of text. So this is an example. This one has, if I was presenting this and I was essentially either reading this, which is a terrible thing to do to your audience, or even sort of talking about it, and having all this, I would be causing a cognitive overload because I have too much going on. So in our brains, words, whether they're audio or visual, kind of fall through the same channel of your brain, versus if something has images, it's a different channel. So these 2 things are on the same channel. Oops, versus having these 2, we've got a different way that they're coming into our brain. And instead of creating cognitive overload, they actually create a supportive learning environment. All right, let's talk about font pairs. My friends, it may be cute, but if your students can't read it, it doesn't matter. I see a lot of teachers who make these adorable things, or you've gone to Canva and you've gotten this great template and it's very cursive-y, but you teach first graders and heck, our middle schoolers don't know cursive so much. So it's really important that we not only think about it from a readability for students, but we also think about it from an accessibility point of view. Um, it's we want to have letters that look like regular A's instead of these type of A's when possible. We want to not have these curly extras on our fonts if we're trying to do readability. If we have students with learning disabilities, we really want to stay in sort of this sans family without all the extras. And we want to try to pick fonts that are really clear and that can be bolded when we want to draw attention. And there's been a lot of research, and I think some of this might be getting outdated now, but there's been a lot of research that when things are italicized, that actually brains with any kind of learning struggles like dyslexia and several of the different diagnoses, they actually notice the italicized less than they notice a regular font. So I found that I try to avoid using those altogether. So let's do a little fun font experiment. And this is fun to do live. It'll be a little different recorded. But if I give you this, I want you to look at that. Can you read that? I bet some of you can kind of struggle and figure out some of this. Let's compare it to this. So on the first one, I'm missing the top half of the font. And on the second one, I'm missing the bottom. And I'm curious how many of you can read it now. This is why we want to avoid caps lock. In caps lock, what we have done is we have taken away all of the visual cues that our brain knows in order to identify the reading. So in addition to, we don't use caps locks because we see that as yelling in text lingo, it actually makes it really difficult for your brain to process. So sometimes when we want to draw attention, how many of us do things like we bold and then we write in all caps and we're thinking, yes, that's going to draw attention to this. It actually lessens the amount of comprehension. So next time you want to get someone's attention in an email that you're sending and you're trying to draw like to a due date, don't use all capitals. Hopefully that's something you didn't know. Some other things to think about with font is this is living proof that we all get better at our jobs as we go on. This is one of the old style of ways I would have designed this slide. I've gotten much better over the years, but I do like to point out some of the features. When you're designing for kids, make sure that you think about bold words. And if you're going to use a fun font, use it for just a heading. Make sure that you have images with captions. You're thinking about icons when you design. You're using things like checklists and bullets. You have things like table of contents. And if you want to direct someone's attention, rather than using all caps, maybe try using color instead. And sort of practicing what I preach, back when I started doing this presentation 10 years ago, this slide was good stuff, but I've also learned that I need to rethink some of my own design. So look at the difference between this slide and this slide, sort of demonstrating the same thing. I got better. So our second section, which is where we're going to spend a lot of time, is on design in general. And when we share out this presentation tomorrow, you're going to see I've hyperlinked. Robin Williams is a designer, and she is known for making design really simple. And she uses something called the CRAP model. I will say that when I taught this to kids, when I used to teach fifth grade, I called it the CARP model because I wasn't going to use crap. But basically, she talks about how contrast, repetition, alignment, and proximity with text make comprehension just easier. And if you Google that concept of CRAP design, you're going to find amazing resources. And I just linked one for you to have as a reference point. And if you want to look at this later, but I'm going to cover some of her big principles. And one of them is contrast. And this is not just good design, but this is also about accessibility. Anyone that has astigmatism of any kind, so like I wear glasses, I obviously have a vision issue. We are going to have issues with the color red. And anyone who wears glasses probably has a slight color blindness to the color red. But also, we need to make sure that we're doing a light font on a dark background or a dark font on a light background. It helps with screen readers to work, but it also helps your brain really understand what it's looking at. And this is the same with color schemes. If you're designing something really cute in Canva and every single thing you do is pastel, it in the same color family, it becomes really hard for your brain to know what it's supposed to be looking at. So adding a pop of a contrasting color or adding text that's a little bit different color family is going to help your brain know where to look. Alignment's also really important, how you align text. There are a lot of people who like to just align everything, especially in Canva, down the center of the page. That actually can make it challenging for your brain to do that eye stuff that we talked about, where it can kind of go from left to right. So there are definitely times when centering text is fine, but a lot of times, especially if it's large bodies of text, it makes it's easier for you to comprehend, especially if English is your first language and you learn to read left to right, if you align it on the left side of the page. A couple of other things are like anytime you can repeat. Now, these are just repeating with shapes, but it's the same idea of repeating. If you were going to give kids a multi-page Google Doc or you were going to create like a slide deck, every time you have a new section break or a new like header of any kind, you want to use the same style. Like I don't want to hand you a slide deck and you'll see on mine, for example, yes, my colors change, but all my section designs, they all have the same vibe and they all tie back up to that first slide. And so we have these repeating visual cues of what we're talking about, and it's consistent across. I don't all of a sudden stop using this style. So when you're designing and you pick a design element, make sure that you include it throughout the entire presentation. Another thing is think about proximity. What is the most important thing on a page? So if I'm giving students a worksheet and I'm giving them things that I know are going to be on the test, and let's say I have a bulleted list of information of like science concepts that I want. If there's something that I know is like the thing kids tend to mess up on the test or they struggle with the most, make that bigger. In the case of this business card, the most important thing on here is I'm giving you my business card so you know my name. So you can see that's the biggest thing on the page. Do the same thing with the materials you make for kids. Give them a list of things and go ahead and make, a couple of the bullets that are really important, a larger size font than the rest of the page. Then that's a cue to them that they know that that's a priority topic. A couple of other things. Think about your visual hierarchy. And basically, again, especially if English is your first language, we read left to right, top to bottom. So if you want them to see something, your eyeballs are going to process here and here first. So if I want something to be clear and aware and kids to understand that that's the thing we're doing, I want to make sure that I put those things first. So tell them what they're about to do. If I were to give them a slide deck about what I'm doing today, I would probably put the name on my slide deck here. And here I would give them some kind of quick short thing to tell them what it's about. So I might say like design for clarity or something that's sort of that quick grab their attention. I also want to be careful that this sort of in a visual hierarchy, that this second line doesn't have too many words because it's so big. And our eyes, remember, we try to read sort of in these jumps and then we sort of go back. I wouldn't want something to be super large and for it also to be really long. So I kind of want to keep those bigger, bolder things shorter. Okay. Not really seeing any comments or questions in the chat, but if there are any, feel free to drop those in. It's a little different doing this without a live audience. Another thing is we kind of been talking about the left to right. This is actually a heat map that I got from a friend. And the way this shows you is literally as we read, we focus our attention here. And then especially English readers, we go to this way first, But you'll notice it starts to cool down by the time we get over here because our brain, remember, we're doing those jumps and then we're swooshing down to the next line. So if you really want something to be important, as I was talking about a little bit ago about how you center text, if you put something in the center of the page, you're not really in the hot zone. So think about where you're putting what's important to you, because this is where the eyeballs and the brain are really going to focus. And by the time they get over here, you might have gone to that point where we've stressed our eyes and our working memory. And so we want to try to keep the most important things to the left side. Another way that our eyes go, kind of a different version of that same idea, instead of that F shape, you can kind of see this design. So they're prioritizing their top things here. And in order to make sure that that heat map keeps you up here, they're using sort of a dark color. So once your eyes sort of are on this dark, it kind of wants to keep following this dark. Versus if you kind of see behind here, there's a Google. This is all sort of white across the top. So that's why your brain defaults to that shape. But if I want to lead you, I can just use an opposite color like this dark against this light. And that's going to make this now be my priority. And this is sort of the second place I look. One of the things that occurred to me during COVID was that seesaw is landscape. And I knew that, but I'd never really made that connection until I was looking at all of the things we were making for kids in seesaw during COVID, and nothing fit on there very well. So think about the screen your kids are going to be viewing. And if it's a smaller screen like an iPad, instead of doing something that would be portrait, something in that long style, on a landscape screen, I would encourage you to cut that page in half. Maybe take a screenshot of the top half and a screenshot of the bottom half. It's better to have your content go over 2 slides and have it match the screen layout than it is for you to have it all on one page, but it's squeezed onto this portrait design when it's really meant to be landscape or viewed on a landscape screen. It was one of those moments where I was like, why didn't I think of that before? How many kids have I messed up? Here's one of those examples I was referring to in the opening about clear path. And we used to give, these are those web quests I was telling you about. We used to give kids things like this, or sometimes we do this still where it's like a choose your own adventure. And we sort of throw all of this on a page. This is really hard for a kid to understand. Now, as adults, we probably naturally would go from left to right. But especially in like a choose your own adventure choice board kind of situation, they may not necessarily go that direction. So I think it's really important that when we have a chance to clean up the design and give them a really clear path, that we should try to do that. So this one, even though they're doing different things, explore, explain, apply, this is sort of the concept, the verb of what they're doing. And then we talk about their task. And by creating a table, it is much easier for a student to follow. I think sometimes we fault kids for not following directions. And I understand, I've taught every grade K-8 and worked with lots of adults. And I understand that, sometimes we don't read as carefully as we should. But this creates such a chaos versus giving them a table just really helps lay it out. And if we can do that to make it easier, why not? Another one, back kind of that cognitive overload we were talking about. We tend to give kids lists of things. Sometimes it's like, hey, here are all the approved websites that you can use. And we give them something like this. It is such a challenge without context for kids to know, wait, what was this link? So this is, in this example, a list of sushi options. However, this is the same list, a couple of the same sites, but look at the difference when you give it a thumbnail image, you give it a title, you give it maybe a sentence summary, and then you hyperlink that. This is something that kids would be able to remember. Oh, this is the site that had the thing that I want. Does this take a little bit more time for us to do? Absolutely. I totally acknowledge the time difference. But if it helps kids understand what each link has and why they would go there, it might be worth the extra time. This is a huge one for me because I struggle. This is a real struggle for me. I am so easily distracted. Ooh, shiny. Um, we sometimes give kids things that are full of visual noise. So if we ever have the option to simplify, to take out the ad, to use something like a reader mode, to really clean something up, just removing that noise from, especially from our students who are easily stimulated, this can help give their brain that pause to really help them process. Remember, I talked about early on how space is super critical in order to help us comprehend. There's no space in here. There's no safe place for your brain to go on this crazy web page and sort of think, oh, okay, I can rest. Nope, it's just too much noise. We need to do less. Doesn't cost you anything to use another slide, to use another screen on a website. So if we can simplify things, we're going to increase comprehension. I also encourage you to design with not with logic in mind. So if my purpose is to get someone to exit here, this is a hard to read font. The arrow is super limited versus what has become our sort of standard. You've got high contrast, you've got an arrow pointing where to go. It's a super easy and clear font. I see I have a comment on here. I'm curious if and how it affects color blindness. If you're talking about visual noise, I don't know about that, but I do know when you start talking about color choices, especially colors like red, and if you don't have a high contrast font, it makes it very challenging for people with color blindness issues. I hope that answered your question. All right, I'm throwing a lot at you. I'll take a moment to pause, see if there are any other questions. If you've got at least 2 new things that you can take back and apply to something that you do, would you just put a little something in the comment, like what's a takeaway that you've already gotten? Or even if you're someone who's like, nope, I knew most of that, that would be really helpful information too. So if you want to throw something in the chat, that would be awesome. All right. So one of them, there are sort of 12 multimedia principles for design, and they are from a gentleman named Meyer. And one of the things that he talks about is the signaling principle. And I was really like blown away by this. It was one of those things that I'm like, oh, why didn't I think of that before? The signaling principle is the idea of telling people what you're going to tell them. And so look at the difference on this frog picture. By bolding the couple of things that are important, in 2 seconds, I know that the takeaway of this is not just about the frog, but specifically something about the frog's legs. By taking these kind of busy, things that come in our textbooks and scanning it and then adding things like an arrow or a circle, now I know that of all the noise on the page, right now, the only thing my brain needs to work on is the owl and the stoat, which I don't know what that is. If I were going to continue teaching with this, I would copy this graphic again, and maybe I would circle around, the ladybird and the spider. But each time I wanted to re-signal or redraw your attention to something else, I would copy this and sort of move those signals. Now, I will say that I personally would never have used red for this. It doesn't really match it. First of all, red is a color I try to avoid a lot because that's the color most people have some kind of color blindness to. In fact, fun fact, if any of you use Seesaw and you go in and you want to edit one of your activities, I have watched so many teachers try to find the delete button when they realize they don't need an activity or they've made a mistake. And the reason is Seesaw used red and it's in all capitals for the word delete. And if you have any sort of vision issue, even if it's not a color blindness, just the fact that people who have any kind of stigmatism are affected by red, you are making it hard for people to find that delete button. So I did send that feedback to Seesaw, and I know that they have since changed their delete button to at least it's not in all caps. It's still red, but it's not in all caps anymore. So, okay. A couple of other signaling things. I sort of did this in my presentation when I laid out the paintbrushes of all the topics that we were going to cover. Anytime that you can give like a signpost, as we call them in design, something that really helps you sort of tell people what you're going to tell them. That's sort of the rule of teaching, right? We tell people what we're going to teach them. We actually teach it and then we review it. So giving these signposts at the beginning, the end of like a slide deck, or if you're giving like a verbal presentation in class, that would be something really helpful for kiddos. So now I'm going to give you some examples in my life of places where I've gone, oh, this is either really good or really bad. If you do this workshop with me for the full, like when I do it as like a half day, you will see things from my Mind, Brain, and Education Master's Program. The number of sins that were committed, and this is one of them. I know that they were trying to use color to draw attention, but let's talk about so many different things. There's not enough space between the bullets. There is too much about the color. They could have spread this out onto more slides, or at least have put space. They have colors that are so varying, but there's no kind of color key. Like if you glance at this, what stands out to you? Really nothing, because everything is trying to compete for your attention. Here is some pre-made Champs posters that I think were bought on Teacher Pay Teacher. And if I want kids to, especially littles, this is in a littles classroom, this is too many words. This has too much going on. In fact, look at the yellow. Like, are you focusing on what it is, or are you focusing on this bright yellow? But if you look at one that's more like this, it's colorful. There's a hierarchy of color. Like we kind of in the US in particular, think of red as kind of that no versus, as we kind of get caution and okay, and then so freedom. Look how fast that is. Any kid could glance at this and quickly see that. So those are, some a good and a bad example. This is from my old district. We see a lot of things that look like this. And we do this inside of our classrooms too. The kids don't know where to look. And that's because when everything is a priority, nothing is a priority. And this one, be kind, is the one that stands out the most. And maybe that's what the message they're trying to get. But if we start thinking about that in the context of a classroom, look at how many posters there are here. This door, these are all different verbs. We've got all of these book covers here. Is it fun? And is this room colorful and inviting? Absolutely. But if you were to be in this classroom, and let's say that you're a kid that's easily distractible, or even if you're not, now you add all of the other things your teacher's saying to you, you're reading in the classroom, all the colors, all the other bodies, all the other movement. We have made this space so chaotic that all your posters on the wall no longer are processing for the kids. And then I think about how many teachers I've heard have said, oh my gosh, kids don't read anything I put on the walls anyway. Well, if this is what you're giving them, I'm not entirely surprised. But if you see something like this one, this is the acronym for writing. This one has really clear, because of the color, almost think of those as like visual paragraphs. And then each one is sort of inside of that box. This is something a kid can glance at, and it's on, even though there's a little bit of noise around the edge, there's what we would consider spacing around. So the brain has some room to process. The colors are all kind of in the same color family. And there's 2 posters versus the entire room. Here's another Champs poster. Can you tell we did a lot of Champs the year I got some of these images? This is all the same. It's centered. Sometimes it's 1 line, sometimes it's 2, sometimes it's bulleted. I can't quickly look at this and necessarily know what I'm supposed to look at. The yellow grabs my attention more because it's a brighter color. And this is not going to be as effective. Whereas I have another teacher who uses a poster similar to this, and I don't think I have a picture of that one, but they have a giant frame, and that frame is the thing that's the bright color. And they put that around each thing, and it really helps sort of process where we want to read. I'm enjoying some of these comments I'm seeing talking about, especially this one where the students have said similar about how they don't like the full walls, that they find it overstimulating. Props to those kids for knowing that. Like, what a great like ability to be self-aware. Um, and I'm gonna just show one more. Each one of these little posters is adorable, but like all this information about author's purpose, and on top of that, it's with how many different things, plus it's on a wall of other words, plus it's got these bright green bins, plus it's got the door. Like, I mean, we all want to have cute classrooms, and I am all for it, but by giving bigger spaces and having less and really using color to sort of create visual chunks, but less of them. And again, that space is so essential. In fact, there's a reason that when you go to Google, that it's a plain white with their colors. They purposely designed it that way because they knew you were about to go in and do a web search and get all of these things that were going to be words and information, and there was going to be an overwhelm. So they purposely gave you a landing page, if you will, for your eyes to have a minute to sort of like rest, give your brain just this little pause before you went into all the visual noise. I love to throw in just fun things. I grew up in the infomercial age, so this is your free gift with purchase. This is one of my favorite ideas I've ever stolen. If you spend the time to make posters and you don't want to have stuff all the time up, but you want to have it accessible, once you laminate your poster, go buy a new trash can or, clean out one you have, throw a few cute little stickers on it. And this is a great way to keep your charts. And then in fact, this teacher, I don't know if you can see on the Post-it right here, these are labeled, so she doesn't even have to open them in order to know what they are. And then she is able to rotate out. And this is a fantastic way to kind of store your posters and be able to be visually flexible. So I am going to talk about color now. And the first thing I want to talk about is the 60-30-10 rule. So if you're going to do a color family, you want to do about 60% of your main color, 30% of your complementary color, and 10% of your accent or your contrasting color. So if you are going to do something, I am not a sports ball person, but I think most of us know that Chicago Bears blue and orange are sort of they're opposite on the color wheel. So you would want to do 60% in that dark blue. You could do 30% in the orange, and then your accent color might be something like white. If you start paying attention to people who do design or start looking at really good Canva templates, I think you're going to start noticing that this is followed pretty heavily in the design industry. So I have a couple of things. Again, when you get this presentation, you should be able to click on. If you're ever trying to figure out what color something is, I love this Chrome extension. You can do this in Canva now. You can do this in Adobe. You can do this in other tools, but I tend to go to this one a lot. What this is a Chrome extension that you click on, and then you can click on anywhere on the screen, and then that will tell you what the color is. So if I see something like, I love this shade of teal and I want this exact shade, I can go up to my Chrome extension, I use this color picker, and then I find out exactly what color that is, and then I'm able to use it in future designs. Canva, as we all know and love Canva, and as is Adobe, they are both great about giving you color families. If you have ever hung out in their design area, it's that first choice in the top left of Canva. You'll find that they have like color families already created for you. But if you're ever like, I want to come up with my own, I've linked several tools that are different palette generators. They're usually 5-color, but you can kind of tell them, oh, I want it to be really like split complementary. So here's kind of that blue and brown, which are kind of opposite. You have all the different color families, and you can kind of play with this. Canva has one as well. Again, you don't really need the Canva one anymore. Oh, it looks like my link isn't working. They have one, but they've built so much into their product naturally, you don't even need that anymore. Here's another one that I used to use for years ago before I had Canva. I like this one because I like it to just sort of go past me and me to go, oh, that's the color family I had in mind. And then I use my Chrome extension to go in and find out what the exact name of those colors are. So lots of ways to find good colors if that's not your thing. But in the name of being culturally responsive, keep in mind that color has a lot of meaning for people. Uh, Culturally, for example, in the United States, we think of red as sort of danger, and it's, our stop. And in China, it stands for luck. So, color green in some cultures means something very different than it does if you were born and bred in the US. So kind of keep that in mind, that color choice does have meaning. Any questions, comments, thoughts? All right. Someone shared that they have a box and they keep it behind their bookshelf so they don't have to roll posters. That's a good suggestion. Thanks for sharing that. All right, as we're kind of I have way more to go and only about 10 minutes. So let's talk about graphics. And I really want to prioritize your purpose of your graphics. And I was just actually doing a presentation yesterday, and it was with a bunch of middle schoolers, and we were talking about literal design. And the storybook that the kid had done was they had talked about that they had come home from church and they'd gone to their house and they had gone to deal with their makeup. And so they literally, as their image for this little self paragraph, they were doing a little narrative. They had done a picture of a church, and on the same slide, a picture of a house. And on the same slide, then they had like 10 different makeup things. And I find that people sometimes do that, or they'll throw a graphic on at like the end, or it'll hang off the side of a page, and it doesn't really have a purpose. So I would encourage you, if as you think about this section, that you not only pick graphics with intention, but also that they match. So this was something that I was doing, and I used a Canva template, and I noticed that I really liked all their little designs. And then I stopped and I went, wait a minute, these graphics don't match the purpose of what I want to do. And so I went back and I changed these with something else. But a lot of times when we use someone else's design, and I think Canva templates are a thing of beauty. If you're like a slide deck girl, like I am, you like Google, use Slide Mania or Slide Carnival or any of those, if that's your jam. Just make sure that when you pick graphics that they're intentional, because our brains sort of imprint learning with visual cues. And so we want to make sure that we're giving a logical cue. If I'm talking to you about using tech with students and I give sort of the universal Wi-Fi symbol, I'm not really helping make that connection to learning. And so I'm glad I caught that before I did that to other people. Another one is, especially in this day and age where design has gotten so much easier, we used to do this all the time. And man, you want to talk about cognitive overload and people that have visual spatial issues, asking them to process that this goes with this and this goes with this, especially in this case, this is written in a different language. So you've got someone trying to learn a second language, connect two languages, and come over here and reach. This is not the best way to design anymore. I had a teacher recently who was showing me what they do in their lab as a back to school activity, and they do it with a microscope. And this is how they had it set up. They had a picture microscope and they had all the pieces. But then I showed her this, and you've got the term right there, and it's touching the thing, and your eyes don't have to travel as far. You don't have to track. I also appreciate that there are two different size fonts. Not crazy about the italics, but we'll forgive them. But this is so much easier for your brain to process than something like this. And this is a quick, simple change that you could do to help our kiddos. Here's another one. This is kind of that I was just sort of referring to with too many graphics. When there's too much, you don't know where or what you're supposed to focus on. Whereas something like this, I've got colors that are opposite on the color wheel. So the orange really stands out. I've got one simple graphic. It explains what it is. I'm not trying to add all these visuals of like scary, because this is too many things. Now my brain actually is more drawn to this, when really the message is, I want you to do this. So little tweaks to our design. I'm going to jump ahead a little bit, cover a few other things. This is a slide I showed earlier about font, and I want to talk about framing. So we talked a little bit about visual paragraphs or sort of having that space to sort of help your brain understand things. Look at the difference between this one and this one. And the only difference is I put a frame around this image. So if you, especially if you have a graphic that you aren't able to remove the background, and so there is like a white background behind it or some color background behind it, then go ahead and put a frame around it. This is one of those chunking sort of things that helps my brain go, okay, this goes together. I'm talking about the same thing. And it's interesting that even though these are the same color, I always think it's so fascinating how just adding that frame makes this one seem like it's a slightly different color. It's a fun little trick on the brain. Okay, so for the rest of my time, I'm going to hit you with a bunch of extras. Remember, I said I'm an infomercial girl. These are my free gift with purchase. So, a couple of things. What digital research is saying. First of all, you want a chunks of teaching. So, your e-learning products, when you're actually instructing online or you're designing something for kids, it should be between 5 to 7 minutes of instruction with one clear takeaway. So if I am doing a thing about frogs and I'm talking to them about all these different things, each slide should be super, I should talk about for, just a couple of minutes, and it should be really obvious that this slide is telling me this one takeaway. This next slide is this one takeaway. Consider doing multiple videos over one concept versus a multi-step video. So videos for students, first of all, should never, 3 to 5 minutes has been since blown out of the water for this. They're now saying it's much closer to 90 seconds for K-12 actually. But it would be better for you to make, especially think about how many, GIFs and how many sort of TikTok videos and Snapchats our kids are used to. So if instead of making one long video, you could make a lot of different things. So the last video I did with a teacher was helping them teach. They're making a division thing. And we created this easy table that let the kids know, like, this is step 1. And then there was the GIF that went with it. Here's the step 2. Whereas in the old days, I would have created one video for that teacher, and I think it would have been harder for kids to track. And then the nice thing is if they need to go back and watch one step, it was really easy for them to get to the part that they wanted to. And then think about graphic organizers. Make sure that your graphic organizers are following these same principles, that you're not giving kids graphic organizers that are so busy that as soon as they add their text, then they become chaotic and messy and unclear. So if you're going to hand kids something to fill out, think about what the final product will look like, and if you're breaking any of those sort of other design laws. Okay, design laws might be a little strong. So I'm going to give you an example of some things about engagement. And this is sort of the before version. This is what I would have created years ago. And, I did some things. I had some bold. I have a reasonable number of words. It's probably a little much, but if I was giving this to kids to read on their own, I have some spaces. Okay. And then as I kind of learned more, I started to get a little bit better. And now you can see I've got an image and novelties about change. So that graphic matches, and there's a cute little Easter egg, and this memes were all the rage. And when I think of videos, I think of YouTube. Same exact words, same thing. I just added a little bit of bullets. I added some images. And if I were handing this to a kid to read, this is okay. But if I were going to talk to you about it like I'm about to now, this is better. Because let's go back and think about if I'm going to have you read it, and I'm going to have you hear me listen, and I'm going to give you a visual, then I've given you 3 things, and I've kind of caused that cognitive overload. So change. If you do something all the time, like you give kids a syllabus or you have an agenda, I think it's a really great idea to every once in a while throw something weird on the page that's like novelty. So I'm known for loving rubber ducks. And I make it a thing that any graphic I design, any club that I do, any PD that I lead, there's a rubber duck hidden in there somewhere. And that people searching for that actually engages them more, and then they walk away with the content. So think about ways that if you always do something the same way, throw something silly in, an Easter egg, a weird link. If you're doing memes have kind of gone away. I know they're not as trendy as they used to be, but I still think they have a lot of value especially if you do them in an educational way. So if I'm trying to teach kids something like the stages of mitosis in science, that's a really hard thing for them to understand. But if I create some cutesy way to remember that, like, or when I think of math, when we learned the planets when we were in, kids, and our teachers all had different little mnemonic devices that helped us remember. Take those mnemonic devices and make them a meme. That would give them a word clue and a visual clue, and that would really help them sort of retain the learning a little bit longer. I include the slide that I'll let you read on your own, but just some different ideas if you're kind of in a rut of things. And, I've been doing this for a long time. Now you have AI. I would certainly jump on AI if I felt like I was in a rut and I was looking for some new ways. But I think it's really fun to have kids do things like design a logo, sort of explain why they would design that for a product, or, the Mars rover a couple years ago. I think doing like timelines where you're having people having kiddos keep track of concepts maybe for the whole year, doing sort of visual timelines, doing more visual Venn diagrams that are less words and more images, but just kind of think about some of the things we do that we ask kids to do a lot of words and instead let them find graphics or images. And then that is such a cool way for us to assess whether or not kids have knowledge, and they're not hindered by their if they're there are writing challenges. And my last thing, because I'm way at time, is I did include some accessibility things. There's an incredible checklist here about some things to think about as you're designing for accessibility. These posters are from an organization out of the UK, and there's some do's and don'ts about things you should do for people with different concerns with learning. And that, my friends, is my time. I hope that was what you expected to attend, that was useful. I have made all my friends in Illinois from doing presentations like this, and then people email me afterward. So I'm one of those people, if you email, I really will respond. So I look forward to connecting with you at other LTC things. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kelly. We really appreciate you being here today. And thank you, everyone in the chat, for just being so engaged and responsive during today's session. Signing off from us at the LTC to you. And again, happy summer. Finish your year strong, and we'll see you in the future.